I introduced them last night, but I know there's a lot of new faces here tonight. Some of you are here with us this weekend. Some of you are new from the weekend. Some of you are we online yet, Dave? We're now online. Let me welcome all of you joining us online. We're so glad to have you wherever you're at, taking part of this. As I said before, this is without a doubt the Indiana Jones of Christianity, and we are thrilled to have him. He's been a biblical archaeologist, historian, scholar for over 30 years studying and traveling the lands of Israel. And tonight we have, through technology, the opportunity to go with him into the land of Israel. And I've been with him to Israel physically, and it is an experience out of this world, and this is going to be the closest we can bring to you to Israel here in America. And if it inspires you, if it fascinates you, if it touches you, sign up. We're going back in October as a tour with Marc. So at the end of October, we're going to go back to Israel as a church. There's going to be a limited number of spots available. We're probably going to cap it at 40 to make it very comfortable so that we all get the most out of the tour and be able to learn. If you're never able to go to Israel, tonight's going to be a great night for you to experience it as best you can. But if you're able to go with us, I would highly, highly encourage you when the sign-up sheet comes out to RSVP immediately and join us in the land of Israel this October, because it's going to be a life-changing experience. So without any further ado, would you welcome my dear friend, Marc Turnage.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for your kindness and hosting us this week. It's been wonderful having these opportunities to be with you all, and thank you for your prayers. What I wanted to do tonight was, I could sit up here and show you a bunch of slides, but you're getting ready to launch into this 13-week series on studying the life of Christ. And so what I thought would be best for us tonight is to take a little bit of a historical, geographical, and archaeological journey into the life of Jesus as we find it in the gospel. So we're going to kind of start at the beginning and we're going to end at the end. And in the midst, we're going to try and bring you a little bit of the land of Israel, because I've got a very dear, good friend who is just a brilliant historian. And he says that the two things that are needed to study history and geography are your feet and common sense. And he's right. But the reality is, even today, often when we go to study history, we don't realize the impact that geography has on history. You can't understand history without understanding geography. Now, for those of you that didn't like geography in school, I'm sorry, but hopefully in the next few minutes, I'll kind of make it a little bit cooler for you, all right? So we're going to dive in with, want to start and just kind of, where in the world are we talking about when we talk about the land of Israel? So this is basically the landmass when we're talking biblical Israel. It sits on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And when we think about the land of Israel, its hills and its valleys are being created by this big scar that we'll come to talk about here in a moment. But what that scar is going to do is it's going to create something that looks like a loaf of French bread, meaning that it's puffy in the middle and it's going to be flat on the sides. And location, location, location. It matters. As I've said before in my time here, this land is as much a character in the Bible as David and Abraham or Peter and Paul. So when we think about this land, we want to understand it for a moment in terms of its macro significance as well as its micro significance. Now, as I said, here we have on the western side, the Mediterranean Sea. We're at the eastern end of the Mediterranean here. Beyond where this picture shows are the eastern Arabian deserts. To the south of us is Egypt. To the north is Damascus and Mesopotamia. Taking you back to your junior high geography, the Greek word meaning the land between the rivers, right? The Tigris and Euphrates. And this sits as the land bridge that connected Mesopotamia and Egypt. In the period of the Old Testament, the most important highway of the ancient world ran right through this land. Controlling this land means you control international travel, international trade, commerce, and communication. That's why the land of Israel is always being fought over. Why you have army after army, whether it's the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and then between the testaments, the Greeks come. And eventually, right before the launching of the New Testament, we have the Romans. Because whoever controls this controls the world. Now think about it a minute. Why would God call Abraham and his descendants to live in this land? Because it's the crossroads of the world. If you have a message and you want to get it out, you take it to the crossroads. And so God puts Abraham and his descendants in this land, and he tells them, you're not going to live there by strength of military. You're going to live on the edge of the desert, right up against the Mediterranean, where rains are not always consistent, where you're going to have to obey me in order for the rains to come in their season. You're going to have to obey me in order to stay in the land. And if you're faithful, you will stay here and you'll prosper. Now, by the time we get to the Roman period, of course, Italy in Rome sits on the western edge of the Mediterranean. And so the world is not oriented as it is in the period of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it's oriented north-south. But then a young Macedonian in the year 333 BC by the name of Alexander, history remembers him as Alexander the Great, conquers the Persians and tilts the world on its axis. So from Alexander on, we think about it as west versus east, even down to today. That's how it was in the Roman world too. But during the Roman period, this still contained the most important highway of the Eastern Roman Empire. So let's talk a little bit about some of the geographic features. There's 4 that I want to just introduce you to briefly. Then we're going to look at a little bit of a geopolitical map for the time of Jesus. And then we're going to get to the good stuff. So, as I said, we're flat on the side. This flat area here is called the coastal plain. This highway that connected Egypt with Mesopotamia runs right through here. Whoever controls this controls the Eastern world. Okay? Then this coastal plain is going to be bisected by this hill country. In this hill country, we find right in this area Jerusalem. Bethlehem is south of it. Hebron is about here. I'll show you all these in a map in a moment. The Galilee is here. In other words, the heart of biblical Israel, both Old and New Testament, is this central hill country. But then we have this scar that I mentioned. This is part of the largest scar on the face of the planet, what is called the Syro-African Rift. In the land of Israel, we call it the Jordan Rift Valley or the Jordan River Valley because the Jordan River runs through it. The Jordan River begins up here in the north, where you see kind of the red topographical mountain. This is Mount Hermon. And the Jordan River begins at the foot of Mount Hermon, where it has 3 tributaries. the Dan Spring, which is the largest, the Banyas, both of those are in the modern state of Israel today. And then the third one is called the Hatzbani, and it's in southern Lebanon. Those three converge about here and flow in. And in the time of Jesus and the time of the Bible, there was a lake in this valley, what is called the Hula Valley. Now, in the 1950s, the Israelis drained the lake, created kind of an ecological disaster, so they've since retried to introduce it into this region. But there was a large lake there, and the Jordan River continued through that lake into this lake that we call the Sea of Galilee, but it's a lake. It's the lowest lake on the face of the planet. It's 600 feet below sea level. It's fresh water. It is not salt water. The Jordan River then passes out of the Sea of Galilee and flows all the way down here to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on the face of the planet, at 1,300 feet below sea level. To help you with distances, from here to here, as the crow flies, is about 60 miles. In that 60 miles, the Jordan River is going to meander about 200 miles. Okay? I'm from the Midwest. When we see the Jordan River, we call it a creek because it's not really that great, miney, or big. Okay? But nevertheless, that's what they have, so that's what they get excited about. Understand, though, that in the time of the Bible, this is the fresh water source for the land, and it's below sea level. Remember what I said, where's the heart of biblical Israel? In the hill country. So that means that they're going to need rain, the rain from heaven, in order to survive. Okay? And then across the Jordan, what is today mostly the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, this also is part of the biblical landscape, and we call it the Transjordan. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about the Transjordan in just a moment. But as you can see, again, high hills coming out of here. All right? In fact, any of you ever heard of Petra? Okay, Petra is in Jordan. Ever watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Or for my younger audience, Transformers 2? All right, both of those were filmed at Petra. Petra sits down here, and it's actually at a higher elevation than Jerusalem, which is why, even though it's the middle of what looks like a desert, I've been hailed and snowed on there twice with groups. Okay, so it can get very cold. Coldest night of my life I spent at a place right here called Kerak. It was absolutely miserable. Don't recommend it. Anyway, this is the biblical geography that we're talking about. So now let's look a little bit more at a map that is a geopolitical map from the time of Jesus. Now, when Jesus is born, there is a Jewish king that is in control of this kingdom known as Judea, or the land of Israel. His name's Herod. We remember him as Herod the Great. Remember Matthew chapter 2, the killing of the innocents, right? Well, Herod served as a client king of Rome. In fact, the Roman Emperor Augustus was a good friend of Herod's. It's a brilliant story. I'm not going to go into it right now. But nevertheless, Herod dies in 4 BC. And his kingdom is divided among 3 of his sons. They all want to be king like their father, but Rome does not deem any of them suitable to be king. So they divide the kingdom of Herod among these 3 sons and give them lesser titles. So this area here where you see Idumea in the south, Judea, and Samaria is given to his son by the name of Archelaus. We find him in Matthew chapter 2. And notice what it is in that land. Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, Shechem, and Samaria. Okay, biblical names, biblical places, the most important of which is Jerusalem. But again, also Bethlehem. And you remember in Matthew, after the Holy Family flees to Egypt, and Joseph learns that Herod has died, but that Archelaus is ruling in his place, they don't come back to Bethlehem. They go up here to Nazareth, because that belonged to another one of Herod's sons. So the area you see here, Galilee, which is west of the Sea of Galilee, west of the Jordan River here, this area of Galilee is given to his son Antipas. You also meet him in the Gospels. He's the one that conveniently removes John the Baptist's head from his shoulders. Okay? He also controls this area in the Transjordan called Perea. So this was Jewish land. This is Jewish land. And then the area where you see Gaulonitis, that was given to Herod's son Philip. You also encounter him kind of tangentially in the New Testament, because he's the one that marries Salome, the daughter of Herodias, who had this adulterous affair with Antipas, and it was really kind of messed up. Anyway, so when we think of the ministry and life of Jesus, we're talking about primarily Galilee and the area of the Golan around Bethsaida. I'll just say this. Aaron mentioned that I've participated in archaeology. About 7-8 years ago now, I was instrumental in launching an excavation to try and find this place here mentioned as Bethsaida. It's the last lost city of the Gospels. There's been a site in Israel that has been excavated for about 30 years that has been identified as Bethsaida. It's not. Other than that, the name works. And so we wanted to dig an alternative site because the archaeology of this other site didn't fit what we knew from the historical sources. So about 7-8 years ago, we started doing a survey, and now we've had 4 full seasons of excavation. Of course, last year due to COVID, we weren't able to. And we have now found a site that fits what the historical sources say, and probably most likely is the town of Bethsaida, which according to the Gospels is the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, at least a quarter of Jesus' disciples, if not more. So this is the landscape of Jesus' world during his ministry. Okay? This is when we hear him going to the other side of the lake. We read this in the Gospels. That means he's not just moving geographically. Notice he's jumping geopolitical lines. He's going from Galilee to the area of the Golan. Okay, in the wilderness of Bethsaida is where he feeds the 5,000. All right? So that's Jesus' territory, particularly the northern part of the lake. But this is the geopolitical division of the land during his life and ministry. So let's start with the beginning, the birth of Jesus. Now this looks pretty familiar to us, right? Well, maybe not exactly, but the idea of Jesus' birth taking place in a barn. Now, this painting comes to us from the Middle Ages. And one of the things to say about Christian artwork, especially that comes to us out of the Middle Ages, is that these European artists who maybe had been brilliant artists were not really informed about the physical setting of the world of Jesus. In fact, until these European artists began trying to conceptualize the birth of Jesus within their European context, we never find Jesus being born in a barn. The earliest depictions of Jesus' birth that we find in the icons of the early church depict his birth as being in a cave. In fact, this is how it was and depicted and even talked about up until the Middle Ages, when European artists began showing him being born like this. Nevertheless, the earliest traditions in the church, even as early as the 2nd century AD, describe his birth as taking place in a cave. That fits what we know from the houses in the land of Israel, in the hill country, around Bethlehem. Nazareth also has this phenomena, and so forth. Now, what I want to show you a moment is a setup of a house, dates to the 1st century BC, so from the time of Jesus, okay? It's equidistant to the north of Jerusalem, as Bethlehem is to the south of it. So I'm not saying this is the house, but you're going to notice some things about it. So here we see a house. This house, like I said, dates to the 1st century BC. And notice what you have back here. You have a cave that the house is built in front of. And you say, hold on, why are you talking about a house? My gospel says that there was no room in the inn. The problem is the Greek word here that gets translated as inn does not mean inn. It means a lodging space, a guest room, even an upper room. In fact, in the Gospels, when Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper and he tells his disciples to go and prepare the place for the eating of the Last Supper, he uses the same Greek word is used. Now, the Gospel of Luke, where we read about the supposed inn, Luke knows the Greek word for an inn because remember the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a different word, okay? You say, well, but hold on a second. What about the innkeeper, right? He appears in all of our pageant plays, dressed in his dad's oversized bathrobe, and he has one line, right? No room. If anybody can find an innkeeper in Luke chapter 2, I'll give you $1,000 right now. Doesn't exist. What the image that we should think about, Luke tells us that Joseph and Mary are coming from Nazareth to Bethlehem. There's a census, but there's something else that's going on here. Because when Luke describes Mary and her journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, he describes her as Joseph's betrothed. But by the time they arrive in Bethlehem, they are cohabiting. Now, Jewish marital practice underwent a 2-step process very similar to what we do today, where there's an engagement, a wedding, and now the married couple lives together. So when a woman would be betrothed to a man, she would remain in her father's house until the man would go off, and often he would build a small marital chamber, an upper room, on the house of his father. Because you live in family units. It's not like we're going to get our own house. And when that was completed, the bridegroom would go and collect the bride, bringing her into now his father's house. There would be a marital ceremony, and then they would live together as husband and wife. So when we read in Luke chapter 2, and in verses 5 and 6, Mary is being described as Joseph's betrothed, and then she's being described as being living with him, it tells us that a marital ceremony took place in Bethlehem, if we understand the culture. Now again, we don't hear about it because that's not the point of it. But this image that we have of Joseph and Mary riding into Bethlehem on December 24th, her 9 months pregnant, getting ready to pop, going from Holiday Inn to Marriott to Motel 6 to Super 8, it's not in the gospel text. We don't know how long in her pregnancy she is when they arrive. It simply says, and after they were there, the time came for her to be delivered. And there was not space in the place where they were lodging. Why? Because this small marital chamber could not handle midwives, relatives, those people that were necessary to bring the baby into the world. Remember, the most critical moment of childbirth in the ancient world for a woman and the child was the actual time of birth. So they couldn't fit in this small marital chamber, so where do they go? In the main room of the house. You say, well, what about the barn? There's got to be a barn, right? Because there's mangers. What do you see here? You see mangers. And these are actually as they were excavated. Because guess what you put in the cave? Your animals. It's not about being born around the animals. It never says that in the Gospels. It simply says that after giving birth, she swaddles Jesus and lays him in a manger. Okay? The animals are in the cave because, as any farmer will tell you, you do not leave the keys in your John Deere tractor sitting out in the field. Okay? So you bring them in for the night and then you take them back out. You say, well, that kind of stinks. Well, yeah, they do not have the views of sanitation that we do. Okay? But when we think about the birth of Jesus, this is the image that we probably should have. It's not Mary and Joseph off isolated in some barn somewhere because this cruel-hearted innkeeper didn't have room. It's actually Jesus being born in a home, surrounded by family. You say, well, that seems pretty common. Exactly, that's the point. Too often, we tend to look for God in the supernatural. We want the angel choirs, we want the explosions, and we don't see him coming to us in the most common and ordinary ways. And that's exactly what happens in the birth of Jesus. Let's move on. So now Jesus is grown up. We're back to our maps again. Remember the area of Samaria, okay? This is the area of Archelaus. But I'm going to jump back a couple slides to our previous map here for 1 second. So this is the territory of Archelaus. Bethlehem, Jesus is where Jesus was born, right? So Archelaus tries to be as brutal as his father was, but he's dumber than his dad. I don't know how else to say it. And so the Jewish people in his territory actually send a delegation to Rome and say, listen, would you get this bum out of here? Rome is like, yes, because now this allows us to bring this territory under direct Roman rule and annex it. And they bring it under the control of Roman governors who live right here at a place called Caesarea. Don't hear about it in the Gospels, hear a lot about it in Acts. But this becomes the seat of Roman governors. The most famous, of course, is Pontius Pilate. We'll get back to him in a bit. So Jesus in his ministry is primarily focused in this area here. He's in Nazareth, but notice Nazareth is going to overlook this area of these wide valleys, this major roadway. Ever hear this saying that Jesus grew up in this kind of bucolic backwater? He's like this hick from the sticks. Nazareth was small. But this area, in fact, if you remove Jerusalem in the first century from the equation, because Jerusalem is unique, even today, in the modern state of Israel, there's no city in Israel like Jerusalem. Okay? So if you remove Jerusalem, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, a little bit more in depth, the seat of Jewish life and learning in the first centuries in the Galilee. And this is where Jesus is going to go. As he becomes an adult, he's going to travel throughout this region. We hear of Cana, right? Turning the water into wine. He's going to migrate from Nazareth to Capernaum, which sits right up here. We hear him cursing Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. And really between this area here, which is a big plain called the Plain of Gennesar, and over here where Bethsaida is, which is called the Bethsaida Valley. Okay? And actually, when you're sitting here looking at this image in the Life of Christ series, you're looking to the Gennesar Valley there. And you're looking at it from a vantage point where if you just literally turned and went like that, you're looking at the Bethsaida Valley. So literally within this geography here is where 95% of Jesus' ministry as recorded in the Gospels takes place. Okay? And he's going to be around the lake. So let's talk a little bit about the people that live in this region. Now, this is taken from a little museum in Nazareth. You know, what in the world is that? Well, it's the nozzle to an oil lamp. Now, what they would do is they would make their oil lamps and make them with bowls. They would use a mold for the bottom part and a mold for the top part. And they would create like this bowl that there would be an opening on the top where they could pour the olive oil in, and then they'd put a wick here, which is why you see kind of the sooty residue there. Now, what's interesting about this, again, I took this picture from in a little museum in Nazareth, and even the curator of this museum doesn't understand what he has in this little broken piece. Because this type of lamp, where the way they create and attach the nozzle onto the bowl is they cut it with a knife. And so that creates this kind of flared look to the nozzle. It's called a knife-paired oil lamp. You'll see here a more popular term for it being called a Herodian oil lamp. Say, really? That's what I came here for? Here's what's important about this. When they have done petrographic analysis on these type of lamps that are found all throughout the Galilee and the Golan, the soil that these lamps are made with all come from Jerusalem. All of them. So why is that important? Because what it tells us is people living in the Galilee and Golan are making pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where the temple stood. We'll talk about that in a minute. And in the temple was the 7-branch candelabra called the Menorah that was representative, okay, of God's light, God's presence. And what do you do when you go on a journey? Bring back souvenirs. And these people would bring back souvenirs connecting to the light in the temple. Now, why is this important for us? If we open our Bibles to Luke chapter 2, we hear about Jesus' family making an annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem every year for Passover. We have the text that says this. I'm not saying that this is the lamp of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. But I am saying this is evidence that people living in Nazareth in the first century were making this pilgrimage. And it says that these Galileans had a connection with Jerusalem and the worship that was going on there. Here we have a village that is north of Nazareth, but this village is fascinating. It's a place called Yodfat. Guarantee you 99% of most tours never make it here. But Yodfat's important because In the years AD 66 to 73, the Jews are going to revolt against Rome. It's called the First Jewish Revolt. This is going to result in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. We'll talk about that again in a moment. Yodfat was destroyed during that revolt, and it was never rebuilt. So guess what the archaeology there becomes? A time capsule. So when you're walking around the site and you see broken pieces of pottery, you're literally touching the same kind of pottery that was common in the Galilee in the first century. And so what we actually have here is a home. In fact, over here in the corner, you can see what's called a tabun. It's an oven for the baking of bread. You can see kind of the layout of these small rooms, but I want to direct your attention to this structure right over here that's a part of this house. And here you see it again. You see the plaster? You see the steps? This is an installation that in Hebrew is called a Mikveh. It's a Jewish ritual immersion bath. Now, this, together with that little oil lamp that I just showed you, because they found those same kind of oil lamps here, begins to tell us who's living in these places. These are people that are concerned with issues of ritual purity. And what we know from the sources, the ancient sources, including the New Testament, is that in the first century, one of the biggest issues within Judaism is the issue of ritual purity. A person would immerse. We hear, let's leave John the Baptist to the side for a moment, but we hear of Jesus' disciples, we have to assume that Jesus himself ritually immersed on a number of occasions. In fact, we hear of Paul after Ananias prays for him and the scales fall off his eyes. It says that he purifies himself. When Paul goes at the end of the book of Acts up to Jerusalem and he's going into the temple, it says that he sanctifies himself, which is another language for purification. They're talking about entering into these ritual baths. And a person would go in because Jewish immersion is self-immersion. Nobody gets in there with you. And you would go in, water must come in contact with every part of your body, and you dunk yourself 3 times. That 3-time practice is probably what gives rise in early Christianity to our Trinitarian baptismal formula. But the fact that we have this in this house, and it's not an elaborate house, it's a common house, speaks to the kind of people that are running around listening to Jesus of Nazareth. Here's another one that we find at another site. In fact, there's 3 sites in the Galilee where you can actually touch the first century. Now, frankly, where most tour groups go, you don't get to touch it. Places like Capernaum aren't really first century. But Yodfat, and this place at a site called Gamla, was another city that was destroyed and never rebuilt. Again, we've got our time capsule. And so once again, in one of the homes there, this is actually also next to an industrial olive oil press. Now, why would you put a ritual bath next to an olive oil press? So that you prepare the olive oil in a pure way so you can send it to the temple in Jerusalem. Again, notice the connection here that these people have with their faith. And also, even in very common ways, how their faith penetrates every aspect of their life. Something else that we find are these little bad guys. I've actually, in our area, the site we're digging, I've dug up several of them. Stone vessels. Okay, this is made out of limestone chalk. Why would you go through that? It's much easier to do clay lamps or clay vessels like we saw. Because again, according to Jewish ritual law, stone vessels can be repurified where pottery cannot. And you find these at places like Nazareth. In fact, 2 summers ago, they found a factory for the making of these right outside of Nazareth. You find them at Capernaum. You find them at Chorazin. So when we begin to look at this and put these data points together, all of a sudden we start to find the cultural world that Jesus is living and ministering in. Who are these people that follow him? Who are the people that he's telling his parables to? Same people that are using these things. Here we see more stone vessels. Now remember his first miracle in Cana? We even read about this in John's Gospel, John chapter 2, right? He's at a wedding feast in Cana, and they run out of wine. Oops. And so they take the water from stone water jars. Those are stone water jars. And he turns it into better wine. Again, the fact that we have stone is indicative of issues of ritual purity. Let's move on. Now, you're looking across Jesus territory. Nazareth is to our back. We are in a valley that is called the Beit Netofa Valley. We're actually standing on top of a site known as Rumah. You say, who cares? Never heard of it. It's okay. Have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Nicodemus? Jesus encounters him in John's Gospel. According to Jewish sources, here at Rumah, Nicodemus had farms that he used to feed the poor out of the produce of his farms. So now does it make sense how Nicodemus from Rumah and Jesus from Nazareth, which is about, maybe 5 miles, 4 miles from here to the south, how they met up? And then, right here, that's Cana. So, in fact, one day when I was a student living in Israel, a group of us decided we were going to see what it was like to trek from Nazareth via the route that most likely Jesus would have used to the Sea of Galilee, to Capernaum. We concluded at the end of about a 14, 15-hour hike that they wouldn't have done it in a day. Because it's about, 40, 50 kilometers? They probably would have used Cana as a way station, stopover point. But this valley here is what is called the Beit Netofa Valley. When we think of Jesus going from Nazareth to Capernaum, he's walking right through this valley. Here you can see, again, a better shot of this valley. Here's Cana again. Yodfat that I showed you is right up here. And how many stories do we find Jesus telling that use things like agriculture? A man went out to sow his field, and some of the seed fell among the path. Some of it fell on the rocks, some of it fell in the weeds, and some of it fell in the good soil. See how a story like that might have a connection for them? Then something else that we hear all the time about in the Gospels are synagogues. Now, there's only a handful of synagogues from the first century. This is one of them. It's back at that site, Gamla, that was destroyed and never rebuilt. And I want to draw your attention to several features of this. First of all, over here's the entrance. And notice how we have benches all the way around here. What then becomes the focal point of the room? Where are all eyes? In the middle, right here. Now, what's very interesting, when we start talking about the history of synagogues, we don't have them in the Old Testament. But when we start talking about the history, our first mention of synagogues comes from an inscription in Egypt from about the 3rd century BC. And there, a Greek term that we find being used in the book of Acts is used about this building, and it's called a prayer house. Because it seems, at least for certain Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel in the 1st century, that prayer was the primary purpose of the Jewish community coming together, but not in the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, the primary purpose of people coming together, and we know this both from literature and even inscriptions, is the reading and the studying of the scripture. What do we find Jesus doing in the synagogue? Reading the scripture and teaching. And remember, we have this story in Luke's gospel where after he's done reading, he sits down and all the eyes in the synagogue were on him. Now do you see how that actually is reflected in the architecture of the building? Here you can see another shot of this same structure. And over here, I'm going to show you something a better close-up of this, but we're going to focus our eyes in just a moment over in that corner there underneath that caper bush. But again, you get this idea of this central hall where you would come together on the Sabbath for the reading and the study of the scripture. Here we're looking back towards, and we've got a small little room here. And that small little room is probably a study room where people could come and learn to read the scriptures. Now, let me explain what it means to read the scripture in a synagogue in the 1st century. There are no chapters and verses. Let's start there. There are also no vowels. Okay? So let's say that next Sunday, Pastor Aaron's going to be preaching, and he's going to ask you to stand up here and read his text, but you don't get any vowels. Don't make a mistake. What does that say about the level of education of these people? It has to be very high. Also understanding that the very act of reading then becomes an act of interpretation. There's no punctuation. So where you put the periods, where you put the breaks, all of that is part of the interpretive process. Have you ever thought about Jesus being educated? The reality is when we understand his culture and his spiritual world, Jesus was a genius. In fact, I'll even go one more. When we compare Jesus' education with that of the Apostle Paul's from a contextual, cultural understanding, Jesus's was superior to Paul's hands down. Who was responsible for giving him this learning? He had to learn, just like you and me. Well, culturally speaking, his father was the one responsible for his education. Now, we don't hear a lot about Joseph. We hear that his name was Joseph, which happens to be the second most common Jewish male name in the 1st century. Jesus happens to be the 6th most common Jewish male name in the 1st century. We know that Joseph was of the line of David. Okay? And no, that's not a made-up thing, because we even know from Jewish sources, including archaeology, that there were people that identified as belonging to the house of David in the 1st century. We know he was a carpenter. But we also have this very interesting statement in the Gospel of Matthew that Joseph, when he finds out that Mary is pregnant before they've come together, therefore being a righteous man, wants to put her away quietly. We read that and go, man, Joe's a good guy. But culturally speaking, When you call someone in Hebrew a righteous man, the word is a tzaddik, you're not just saying that they're some kind of run-of-the-mill nice guy. You're literally saying that they're a learned sage. Where did Jesus get his learning from? His dad. Because a father is responsible for teaching his son a trade and Torah. And by the way, we can also see Joseph's hand on his other son, James, because between the book of James, what we find in Jesus, and even little details that we find about Joseph in the Gospels, I can triangulate what stream of Jewish piety they belonged to in the first century. And I can say that the common denominator between Jesus and James is actually their father. So this is where study is going to go on. It's also going to go on in the home. I told you we'd look at this little spot. This little niche right here probably originally contained a wooden box, like a wooden cabinet. Guess what they're going to keep in there? Scrolls. Torah scrolls. Based upon the amount of biblical scrolls found among the world-famous Dead Sea Scrolls, and based on what we think are rough population estimates of the land of Israel in the first century, we should assume that there was one Torah scroll for every 20 people. Now, if we say, well, the guys that write the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're kind of a monastic group there, but still, nevertheless, a small village like Nazareth, a small village like Gamla, a small village like Yodfat, a small village like Capernaum, a small village like on and on, should have at least a Torah scroll for the village, if not multiple. Judaism was already a culture of the book. A young boy, by the time he was bar mitzvahed in the first century, which was the age of 12, would have committed the 5 books of Moses to memory, Genesis through Deuteronomy. It would be like if I said in here, for God so loved. Now, most of you probably jumped to John 3:16. Some of you, if you were in some kind of Bible quiz or something like that, you're probably into John 3:17 by now. Imagine having that level of biblical literacy with the Old Testament, and you're starting to understand what Jesus and his audience were like. But what's really fascinating among the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we talk about the biblical scrolls, and by biblical I mean Old Testament, there were no New Testament scrolls found there. But among the biblical scrolls, there were 3 that were found most prominent. Number 1 was the book of Psalms. We have more copies of the book of Psalms than any other biblical book among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Number 2 is the book of Deuteronomy. And number 3 is the book of Isaiah. Open your New Testament. Guess what 3 books are quoted more than any other in the New Testament? Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. Even when you go on to the earliest rabbinic, which is written down later, commentary, which is on the book of Exodus, guess what 3 books they quote the most from? Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. Is there a pattern? Probably. I often will tell people, you want to understand the Bible of Jesus better, start by reading through those 3 books. And start reading the Gospels in concert with it. You'll actually pick up on a lot of very interesting things. But this is where the Torah scrolls would be kept for this village. Now here's another one of these first century synagogues at a place that is a new excavation, new-ish I should say. It's about 15 years old now, at a place called Magdala. Some people think that this is the hometown of Mary Magdalene. I'm not convinced of that, but that's a whole nother conversation, so we'll leave it. But notice a few things that we've already seen. Here we have the long study room. There's the main hall. And in the center of the main hall, we have this stone. Okay, here again, you see the main hall. Where are all the eyes? In the middle. Okay? And here we have, again, this stone. And this stone, this is a replica now. The original has been taken away. But this is where they found it. And what's interesting about this stone, when you look at it, it's kind of blurry in this picture, but right here you have a menorah. Down here at the base of the menorah, it looks to be possibly an altar, like the altar of incense. And one of the things that's very interesting is in the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place in the temple, were three primary implements. The candelabra called the menorah, the incense altar, and the table of showbread. Now you remember John the Baptist, his father was Zechariah, who was a priest. And he got to go in and light the lamps and burn the incense at the altar. And once you did that as a priest, you could never do it again. It was actually a lottery that you won. And what we find here is a menorah, an incense altar, and some have even suggested that this stand is to look like the table of showbread. But again, notice the connection. What's also interesting is this is not flat on top, it tilts. Okay? And in the four corners, you will notice that it is rough. And what they've suggested this is a base of a podium where a Torah reader would stand up to read, because in Jewish tradition, you stand to read the scriptures, you sit to teach. If you go to Luke chapter 4, Jesus in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he stood to read and he sat to teach. This is probably the base of a stand, but even in the iconography of this thing, they're connecting what they're doing with Jerusalem. This is from Chorazin, and it's a chair that was found in that synagogue. This is what is called a seat of Moses. We read about it in Matthew 23. The Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, therefore do everything they tell you to do. But guess why this is called a seat of Moses? Because it would sit in the center of that hall, and guess who sat on it? The Torah reader. The guy who just stood up to read, who then gives the scroll back to the attendant, who puts it away in the cabinet, and then sits to teach. Exactly what we hear again and again and again when Jesus teaches in the Gospels. This one, why don't we have more? Probably most of them were made of wood. This one happens to be made out of this black volcanic stone known as basalt. We're back in the Magdala synagogue, but I wanted to show you how beautiful. We have this mosaic floor. We have the fresco work on the columns. This was actually a very wealthy community. It was known for the salting of fish. And salt was not a condiment you put on your food in the ancient world. Salt was a commodity. In fact, there is a period, a few hundred years after Jesus, where Roman currency became so devalued due to inflation that they started paying soldiers with salt. The Latin word for salt is sal, where we get the word salary. Or even the idea that someone is not worth their salt. But the salting of fish speaks to the wealth of this community. And so, of all the first century synagogues that we find in the land of Israel, and we only have about 6, this is the only one that shows such beautiful decoration of mosaic floors and frescoed columns and frescoed walls like we see here. This was the little niche, if you will, where probably the Torah scrolls were kept in Magdala. So is it any wonder that we find Jesus quoting scripture to his listeners? Because they all know it. Here we find, this is from Capernaum. This is the synagogue in Capernaum. It's from a later period. It's huge. Okay. This is not the synagogue that Jesus would have been in, but nevertheless, this is the area of Capernaum, which Matthew's gospel says was his home. Here you can get kind of a panorama of it. One of the things you begin to notice in this period that the focus is not on the front. The focus is actually at the doors, because the doors face towards Jerusalem. And when Jews pray, we already see this in the book of Daniel, they pray towards Jerusalem. And from this period, the central part of what went on in the synagogue was prayer. In the time of Jesus, prayer wasn't done in the synagogue. Prayer was done in the homes, and prayer was done in the temple. Remember the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector? They went up to the temple to pray. Peter and John in the book of Acts go up to the temple at the time of sacrifice to pray. Here we find a home. Notice the nice little manger. But this one's really interesting for several reasons. You have here this large courtyard that rooms are added to. This style of home is called an Insula Home, I-N-S-U-L-A. And it was a central courtyard that would be open because there is no air condition in ancient homes. Now, these walls would have not been exposed. They would have been plastered over, but still, it's hot. Okay? Around the Sea of Galilee in the summer, you can easily get to 114, 116 with about 80% humidity. It's awesome. Okay? So most of life is being taken care of in the courtyard. But what happens is they would, as a son would get married, he would add a room onto his father's house. Some of these Insula homes have over 100 rooms attached to them. In John's Gospel, Jesus at the Last Supper is trying to give his disciples an idea of what heaven was like or will be like. He says, "In my Father's house are many rooms." This is the image he's using of a family living together in community. It's something that they understood. We also hear of Jesus teaching in homes. We should assume he's teaching in these courtyards. Think of the story of the healing of the paralytic. It could be that they're going up on the roof and letting the man down into the courtyard area. Okay? Now we get to Jerusalem. What you see here in this big box that comes through here is what is called the Temple Mount. Underneath here is a mountain. So I'm going to use a very crude illustration for a little bit. I'm going to use my arm. So my arm here, okay, this is north, south, east facing you, west facing me. This is Jerusalem that David conquers. He conquers this city because there's a spring right here on the eastern side called the Gihon Spring. They've excavated the towers that were around this spring that date to the time roughly of Abraham, and they are the largest fortifications that have ever been found in the country from that period. They're over 3 stories tall. Okay? And this is what David conquers. It's about 9 acres. His son Solomon is going to extend the city to the north, and at the top of this hill, which the Bible calls Mount Zion, he's going to build the temple. That temple is going to be destroyed in the year 586 by the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar. When the Judeans return under Zerubbabel, that we read about in the Old Testament, they're going to rebuild the temple here on top of this, but it's a small temple. Fast forward a couple hundred years, And what begins to develop here is this large platform, which basically is a shoebox that's been turned upside down. It's 35 acres on top. Now, somewhere up here in the first century stood the temple of Herod the Great. It was built by Herod. Herod of Matthew chapter 2, the killing of the babies, that guy. He builds this temple, which, to give you a sense of scale, this golden dome of the rock, which was built in the 7th century AD, it was built as a Muslim shrine, but it's in the style of a Byzantine church because the architects of it were actually Christians, even though it was built as a Muslim shrine. So this building here, if you took another one of them and stacked it up here, that's the size of Herod's temple. Even the Jewish rabbis who hated Herod's guts said, "He who has not seen Herod's temple has not seen a beautiful thing." There would have been a large colonnaded portico over in this area that was called the Royal Stoa. And this was the center. In fact, in the New Testament, this piece of real estate is mentioned more than any other place in the entire world. So much for the temple and the sacrifices and so forth not meaning anything to Jesus and his followers. In fact, Paul, on his last journey to the land of Israel, is going to skip Ephesus, where he lived multiple years and started and founded a community. He's going to skip meeting with the Ephesians so he can get here for pilgrimage. This is ground zero for the New Testament. And this vantage point that we're looking at is from the Mount of Olives. The valley that you see here is what is called the Kedron Valley that we hear about in the Bible. And we're looking towards the west. By the way, remember that house I showed you with the mangers in it? It's from right there. Now, after Jesus, after Paul, Roman armies are going to come here in August of the year 70, and they're going to level this. They're going to destroy the temple. They're going to destroy its walls. And in the later Roman period, there's going to be a Roman pagan temple built here. During the Christian Roman period, there's going to be at least 2 churches up here. And then today you see the Muslim mosque, which is called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, here, and the Golden Dome of the Rock. Okay? Here, and we'll talk about it in a moment, this is the traditional site of the crucifixion of Jesus, what is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay? It's inside the walls today, but the old city walls today have nothing to do with biblical Jerusalem, either in the Old Testament or New Testament period. But when Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the final time, he's coming here because of pilgrimage of Passover that is focused on this mountain. Okay? Here's a model of what Herod's temple looked like. Now remember I showed you the Dome of the Rock? The height of the Dome of the Rock is here in terms of scale. This was Herod's temple. It was a beautiful structure. One of the things we know is that it didn't look this bland because they've actually found the tile from the floor of this, and it's a wash in color, and I have some pictures of it here in a moment. But inside of this area here, which was called the Court of the Women, that didn't mean that women couldn't go further than this. It meant on the pilgrimage festivals, this was as far as women could go because of the crowds. But you have here 4 chambers: the court of the wood, the court of the oil, the court of the Nazarite, and the court of the leper. 3 of these are connected to what we find in the New Testament. Which ones? First of all, the court of the wood. How? Because according to one of the earliest Jewish documents, written in the 2nd century AD, the family of David were responsible for bringing wood to the court of the wood. And the wood was used for the burning for the sacrifices. Who do we know from the line of David? Jesus. What about the court of the leper? When we hear Jesus healing the lepers in the Gospels, what does he say? Go show yourself to the priest as commanded by Moses. This is where they would come, and the priest would mark them as clean and allow them to re-enter society. The other one is the court of the Nazarite. In the book of Acts, Paul, twice after his Damascus road, performs a Nazarite vow. Nazarite vow typically lasted for 30 days. You cut your hair at the beginning and then you cut it at the end. During that 30-day period, no razor touched your head. You also abstained from any contact with the fruit of the vine, any contact of coming in contact with a corpse, and sexual relations. For that 30-day, you were setting yourself apart. Paul does this twice in the book of Acts. He would have come here. When James encounters Paul at the end of the book of Acts and says, we want you to pay for these individuals who have made this vow, to make the vow, they would have gone into that court and done it. Okay? Let's move on. Around the Temple Mount, we find these ritual immersion pools. We've already talked a bit about them. What's cool about these is you see this little barrier? That's for public ritual immersion. And if you notice, it's offset. So there's 2/3, 1/3. That's because you've got people going in and people coming out. Now, ritual purity has nothing to do with sin. It simply means I cannot go into sacred space like the temple, and I cannot partake of sacred meals. So I have to immerse. But if I'm coming out and you're going in and we touch each other, I get your cooties and now we got to start all over again. All right? Here we find, and this was actually discovered by a friend of mine, this is the pool of Siloam that we read about in the Gospels, in John's Gospel, also hear about it in Luke's Gospel. This was the largest ritual immersion pool in Jerusalem. It's an acre square. Dates to the 1st century. You can see the steps. It was actually being spring-fed by this Gihon spring. When we think of the story in Acts 2, where multiple thousands come to faith in Jesus and they are ritually immersed, this is the most likely candidate for where that's going to take place. You could immerse thousands of people here at one time. Okay? My friend also found this little token, and what you have up here in Aramaic is the phrase, pure to the Lord. And probably after you went into the ritual immersion bath, because how do the people, kind of the Levites policing the entry to the temple, know if you're clean or not? You were probably given this token. And you would show it that you're pure to the God. And they would let you go in. So every time we hear of Jesus on top of the Temple Mount, he's ritually immersing. He would have probably received a token like this. Every time we hear of Mary and Joseph on the Temple Mount, same thing. Every time we hear of Paul or Peter or John, same process. So this is approaching the Temple Mount from the south. We are a pilgrim. We've just immersed ourselves in the pool of Siloam. Now we're going to start traipsing up these stairs because we're going to enter from the southern side. These are actually some of the stairs. What's interesting is you'll notice that you have a wide step and a short step, a wide step and a short step on up. This is probably for two reasons. Number one, if you were a pilgrim, you may only make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem once in your life. You don't approach the house of God frivolously. So these steps do not allow you to run up them. They force you to walk in a circumspect way. The other thing that's been suggested is that they are organized in such a way that pilgrims, as they would ascend to the house of God would sing the Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 through Psalm 136. And although we don't know any of the musical cadences of the Psalms, it's possible that these were set in such a way that it fit the natural rhythmic singing of how they would sing the Psalms of Ascent. As they would come up, they would encounter this arch, which all that's left of it today is the spring of the arch here. When it was built, it was the largest archway in the entire Roman Empire. Let that sink in a moment. It's called Robinson's Arch because of the American in the 19th century, Edward Robinson, who identified it. But down here, you find these little stalls and shops. You find places over here for the changing of money because you had to change your currency into the shekel of the temple. You had to buy your sacrifices here because it was not conducive to bring your sacrifices at a long distance or a long journey. So what do the priests in Jerusalem have? Ever play the game Monopoly? Yeah, they had one of those. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then you would enter into the temple. You had these large gateways here, and they are very large, by the way. They're sealed up now. That one has been completely reconstructed. You entered on the right, you exited on the left, unless you were in mourning. If you were in mourning, you switched your direction. That way, when people that were coming out saw you coming in, they knew that you were in mourning, and therefore they could comfort you by saying, "May he who dwells in this house comfort you." You would enter in and you would go through these series of steps. These are now underground and nobody can get in there now. I've actually been in there, but that was in a time long gone by. And you have these beautiful arcades that you would then come up, exiting onto the Temple Mount platform, which would be covered in these flooring tiles. They've actually found these and been reconstructing them. Now, let's talk about the priests for a moment. Jesus of Nazareth is going to come into Jerusalem, and he's going to have this outcry against those who are selling in the temple. It says, "My house is to be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves." What he is challenging is not the temple, but the financial corruption of the priesthood. They have found in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem homes that belong to these priests, the largest of which is over 6,000 square feet. You'll notice that they are decorated with mosaic floors. They have these stone vessels, again, telling us that they're interested in ritual purity. Let me back up here a second. We also find in these homes fine imported Roman china. We find fresco work on the wall, crown molding in the ceilings, hand-blown signature glassware. Whoever is living in these homes is not suffering under Roman occupation. But Jesus of Nazareth rides into Jerusalem and points his finger at them and says, "You're corrupt, and because of your corruption, God's going to judge you in this place." And they've got to get rid of him. Why? Because of his popularity with the people. We often hear that the crowds of Jerusalem turned against Jesus. Usually it gets said something like this, that the crowds that cried Hosanna on Palm Sunday cried Crucify on Good Friday. I challenge you to read your Bible. First of all, the crowds crying Hosanna on Palm Sunday are his disciples. So unless his disciples are the ones accusing him, crying for his crucifixion, that doesn't work. Moreover, in the Gospels during Jesus' last week, we hear the refrain over and over and over that the crowds hung on his every word, that the chief priests, their scribes, and the Sadducean leaders, the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem, wanted to remove Jesus, but they couldn't because of the crowds. Ultimately, when do they have to come out to arrest him? At night. Why? If everybody had turned against him, why not do it in broad daylight? Oh, that's right, they hadn't. And Jesus even acknowledges this by saying, I was in the temple every day teaching. Why didn't you arrest me then? And this is one thing I love about the Lord, is he has a sense of sarcastic humor, because I think you've picked up by now, so do I. So he's like, oh yeah, that's right, you couldn't because a riot would break out on your head. He was a threat to their power and their money. And it's always one of three, right? Power, sex, and money. We've got two of the three here. People don't usually kill you over their theology. They will kill you if you mess with their power and money. It's exactly what's going to happen to him. So the chief priests are going to take Jesus from their home and bring him to this place right here. This is the palace of Herod the Great that was in Jerusalem. When we think about where the wise men come to meet Herod, in Matthew's gospel, it's here. When we think about where Jesus is brought before Pilate, it's there. We know that the Roman governors who lived in Caesarea, remember I showed you on the map on the coast? When they would come to Jerusalem, they dwelled here. And this is going to be the place where he is going to be condemned, to be executed. The palace is guarded by these three towers that Herod builds on its north. Jerusalem is always vulnerable from the north. And he builds these three towers. He names one Phasael after his brother who was killed. Another one, Hippicus, after probably the commander of his cavalry force. And then the third one after his beloved wife, Mariamne, whom he has killed. But this little rock outcrop here is actually part of a quarry that goes back to the time of the Old Testament period. And once the good rock was used, it became a place of tombs. And so what we find is in excavations in the Jewish quarter, they actually excavated the gate that was in the northern stretch of the wall. We know it from the Jewish writer of the first century as the Ginat gate. Josephus, the Jewish writer, tells us. Ginat in Hebrew means a little garden. John's gospel tells us that in the place where Jesus was executed, there were gardens. You name a gate for what's outside of the wall, not what's inside of it. And so what you're looking at here, all of this is the fill, but here you see one of the wall lines of the gates. And this is most likely the gate through which he's going to be led out of the city, carrying the crossbeam to his place of execution, which again is going to be in the vicinity of this rocky knoll. Now, I'm only 46, I wasn't there. There are two places in Jerusalem that are identified as the place of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. One of them only becomes known in the 19th century. And really, the reason why it becomes known is because of British politics, okay? The tomb that is shown to visitors there, although it's a beautiful garden, the tomb dates to the 6th century BC. It absolutely, most certainly cannot be the tomb Jesus was put in, because the Gospels say he was laid in a new tomb, okay? So that site is out. Is this the place? Again, I'm 46, I wasn't there, but from the standpoint of archaeology, everything that we know from the Gospels about the location of Jesus' execution fits what we find in this place. In the 1970s, in a neighborhood north of Jerusalem, they actually found the crucified ankle bone of a man. And what happened to this poor soul is the iron nail hit the wood, and there was a knot in the wood, and so it hooked, and so they had to cut his foot off and throw it in the bone box he was buried in. But what this tells us is this is more likely how people were crucified. Ignore the loincloth because it wasn't there. You were stripped naked. Crucifixion was about humiliation and torture. What they would do is they would put a piece of wood on the outside of the ankle bone to increase the surface area of the nail head. They would drive it through your ankles. So you're actually straddling the upright piece of wood. There would be a small piece of wood that your butt set on. But in this typical position, you could either be tied or you could be nailed. But your body weight is being borne by your thighs. So the idea of Jesus dying from suffocation does not happen in this form. Probably what kills him, because remember, he's beaten beforehand, and he's given a Roman beating, which means an unending, until basically they get tired of ripping you to shreds. We know from Roman writers that many people don't even survive the beatings to make it to the crosses, because they use this really nasty whip that would be braided pieces of leather, that at the end of the leather they would put metal, pottery, bone, glass. And as these braids wrapped around, they would rip out your eyes. They would rip off your flesh. They would emasculate your genitals. And so in this position, you can breathe fine, but given the beating, you're probably going to die from hypovolemic shock. Now, some people make a big deal and say, well, you know, the New Testament doesn't really get too big about crucifixion and all the gory details. That's because it was so heinous and gory. Everybody had seen a crucified victim before. You could actually live for days on crosses. This is kind of what you would think of, because the Romans are going to crucify people along roadways. Because ultimately, crucifixion is about crowd control. Note to self, don't mess with Rome. The title that Pilate puts on Jesus' cross is not his confession of faith. It is him openly mocking Jewish hopes of redemption, saying, this is what we do to your King of the Jews. It's like hanging someone in effigy. This is the building today, what is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's what it's called in the Western tradition. The Eastern tradition calls it the Church of the Resurrection. This church has been destroyed and rebuilt 6 times since it was originally built in the 4th century AD. The original church was much larger, much more beautiful. It is shared by 5 different Christian denominations: Catholic, Orthodox, Armenian, Coptic, and Syrian, and then the Ethiopians have a place up on the roof. Inside you see today this structure that is built over top of what has been identified as the tomb of Jesus, but what was most likely the tomb of Jesus has been destroyed, both in the destructions of the church as well as pilgrims wanting to take a piece of the tomb with them. When we think, though, of what the tomb looked like, we should get something like this. Small little door entrance, okay? And then you're going to seal it with a blocking stone like this. Think of a cork in a champagne bottle. You say, but what about the rolling stone? Okay, in Hebrew, this type of stone is called a golel. And the word golel comes from the root galal, which means to roll. So even though it's square, which by the way makes sense out of the angel sitting on it, you don't sit on a round stone, this is probably what you're thinking about in terms of the style. The other thing I'll show you is that the style of the tomb, if I'm going to use my hand a moment, the doorway would be my wrist, my palm is going to be the antechamber, and there's going to be a low bench here and a pit in the center where they're going to prepare the body for burial. Once the body has been prepared, you do not embalm in Jewish tradition. It's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You would put it in one of these niches, which were called a koch. The body would remain there for 12 months. At the end of 12 months, in the first century, they would come and they would gather the bones and they would put it in a bone box, a stone box that would be the length of your femur and the width of your hips, because when you're all decomposed, that's as long and as wide as you are. It's at that time, once the bones were put in this box, that they would rebury it, and that's when you speak of someone being buried. Please pay very careful attention. The Gospels never say Jesus was buried. He was put into a tomb. We get the language of burial from Paul because in the Roman world, when you inter someone in a tomb, you call them buried, just like what we do. Finally, he doesn't stay there. And what we have here is the stretch of road. It's actually one of the saddest places in Israel. This is the Emmaus Road. But as you can see, it's overgrown and it's being destroyed. It sits in a small valley called Ma'ale Haromim, the Ascent of the Romans. But you'll remember the story. Two of Jesus' disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and the risen Lord encounters them on this road. So what we've done tonight is we have taken a journey. And hopefully, as you now start studying the life of Christ and the teachings, you will see that Jesus was a real person who lived in real time and space and was a part of a real culture, who had a very real faith. And as you go back and as you're going week by week and day by day, reading the readings, think about some of these places. Think about some of the things that you've seen. Pay attention to the language of the Gospels because there's so much detail, as I've tried to show a little bit here tonight. Thank you.
Excellent, Marc. How many of you would love for Marc to come back later this year and do some more? Please keep Marc's father in prayer. It's been a great night. We're going to do this again. We have a passion this year as a church family. One of the missions we have is to go deeper in our faith, to go deeper in the Word, to go deeper into Christ in every area, and that's going to be a thread throughout this entire year. And this is just kicking off the year with Life of Christ, and I'm so glad we had Marc to come in the beginning of it to really kind of establish that foundation. Have a great night, everyone. I know it's cold in here, so we're going to let you sneak out, and thank you for coming. It was a great night.